the change of the tide. They all saw what was coming. They all knew that eventually they could not stay in Kishinev or any place in the former Soviet Union. They just didn't have the wherewithal to be able to leave. I think Bialik was talking to the cowardness, but also the intense faith in God. God would protect, God would eventually save. And I don't think Bialik believed that. And I think a lot of people, whether they survived the Kishinev pogroms, or we had other families that came from Odessa that watched their families be shot into the trenches at Baba Yar. I think many of them lost their faith in God, but they
right.
felt
And Bialik is I think accusing them of a piety that he finds to be embarrassing.
exactly.
If you take a look right at the end of that passage, I'll show it back to you in a moment. What is the big question on the lips of these men who have watched their wives raped, some in the most ghastly form? I'm a Kohen. Am I allowed to sleep with her? Like, that's your question?
So,
where were they? Hang on one second, Susan. Where were they? How did they respond? And so Bialik is, for the first time, to a very wide audience, suggesting that the Jews bore some responsibility for their own fate. And this idea, this disgust at the cowardice, the cowering, these Jewish men, what did they do? Did they pick up arms and try to fight off this pogrom? Did they try to defend their women? And it's interesting, if you go back to the text, right, of the poem, who does he invoke here? He says, right, go down, right, to see this horrible thing that happened, right? And then in that dark corner behind the cask crouched all of these people, right, watching this terrible thing happen, crushed in their shame, right? These were the inheritors, right, of the Maccabees. And he deliberately uses that language of the Maccabees to say, where are you, right? Come now, and I will bring thee to their heirs, the privies, jakes, and pigpens, where the heirs of Hasmoneans lay with trembling knees, concealed and cowering, the sons of the Maccabees, the seed of saints, the scions of the lions, who crammed by scores all the sanctuaries of their shame, so sanctified my name. Because the language is so rich. It was the flight of mice they fled. The scurrying of roaches was their flight. They died like dogs and they were dead. And on the next morn after the terrible night, the son who was not murdered found the spurned cadaver of his father on the ground. Now, wherefore cost thou weep, O son of man? He's utilizing the language of the book of Ezekiel. But if we look at this sort of remarkable text, right, he is saying these Jewish men who did nothing to rise up and fight back against this pogrom, you guys are the descendants of the Maccabees. You guys are the descendants of King David. And what is the obligation of a Jew, right? What is the obligation of a Jew when someone's life is at stake? If someone puts a gun to your head and says, kill him or I will kill you, you're supposed to, martyr yourself. And that's called Kiddush Hashem. That's how you sanctify God's name. How did these folks sanctify God's name? By hiding and by not fighting back. So this particular poem and the response to it has a huge influence on a 23-year-old Zeb Jabotinsky, who just before this pogrom had decided to build a Jewish self-defense force in Odessa to help protect the Jewish community in Odessa against a pogrom that was starting to come up there. Jabotinsky, after these pogroms, decides that he is going to get involved in Zionism. And he attends the 6th Zionist Congress in 1903. And there in that Congress, he ends up meeting Theodor Herzl. And he writes in his diary about what it's like to meet Theodor Herzl, which is absolutely incredible. Hang on one second. I'm going to just share a little bit of that. If I can. Hang on one second. I'm just going to pull this up. Where are we? That's not what I meant to do. Hang on one second. Okay, so he's writing about his experience. There's Jabotinsky in 1910. He, like Begin, always looked a little frail, a little small. And he writes about his experience there. He said he had sort of talked about his experience, and he gets to the conference, and it says here, I was introduced to a thin and tall young man with a black triangular beard and a shining bald head called Dr. Weitzman. This is how Weitzman becomes the first president of Israel. And I was told he was the leader of the opposition. I felt immediately that that was my place also, in opposition, though I didn't really know why. So when I saw that young man sitting with a group of his friends around a table in a cafe, engaged in a conversation full of intensity, I came toward them and asked, I hope I'm not intruding. And Weitzman answered, you are. And I went away. This is not what you call audacious hospitality. And he talks about how he went to go, I'm just checking something here. He talks about how he went to go to speak, and he starts to speak about his feelings, and it happened that no one really wanted to hear him. So anyway, he says, my turn came, and they were each allowed to have 15 minutes, and he said, I wasn't even allowed that. And if you take a look, you know, Chaim Weitzman is in the corner talking with a bunch of people, and as he's speaking, he says, hey, you, shut up, no more. And Herzl, who himself was in another room, heard the noise of them yelling him to step down, and he came out and he said, what is he saying? And so they said, and so Herzl comes up behind him and he says, your time is up. And he says, and these were the first and the last words I ever had the privilege to hear from him. But then at the end of his little passage, he talks about it. It was at this 6th Zionist Congress that they were voting and eventually decided not to adopt the Uganda plan. The idea that you would create a way station for Jews to escape the pogroms in Europe by going to Uganda or Kenya or in sub-Saharan Africa. And he votes no. He was the only delegate from where he was from who voted no. But he said, right here, I felt that the Congress reached such a height, but where am I? I'm in the wrong spot. He says, nobody tried to persuade me to vote as I did. Herzl made a colossal impression on me. This word is no exaggeration. No other description would fit. Colossal. I am not one of those who will easily bow to a personality. In general, I do not remember, out of all the experience I've had in my life, one man who made any impression on me whatsoever, either before Herzl or after him. And so when we look at Jabotinsky, he embraces this Zionism, but he embraces a different kind of Zionism than Herzl does. Herzl believed that you could create this new entity and people would just stop hating Jewish people. And Jabotinsky, after the pogroms in Kishinev, realizes that no, that's never going to happen. Anti-Semitism is a disease, and that they are never going to get over it. And the only thing that you can do is to create a nation state that you can defend and that is strong enough to withstand the onslaught of those who might hate and needs to then build that sense of respect. And it's only with that sense of respect that we will be able to create a solution to the anti-Semitism of Europe. So going back to Jabotinsky, he attends a conference in 1906 in Helsinki called the Helsingfors Convention, because you didn't have freedom of speech in Russia, so they had to go to Finland to speak. And he creates this idea of synthetic Zionism. And synthetic Zionism was predicated on the idea that you had to do two things at once. One is you had to build and try to promote as much immigration to Palestine as possible. And the second thing you had to do was to build a strong sense of Jewish national identity in Europe. And he sets about trying to do this. He eventually goes to work as the leader in Constantinople and editor-in-chief of a newspaper called the Jeune Turk, which was pro-Young Turkey. This was before the Young Turks committed the genocide on the Armenians. What they liked about the Young Turks was that they were in favor of dismantling the monarchy of the Ottoman Empire in favor of a constitutional government. And then in World War I, there was a big question among the Jews in Palestine as to who they should support. The general consensus among most Zionist leaders was that you should either stay neutral or, if anything, show some measure of support for Germany and for the Ottoman Empire. First of all, we have to remember that in World War I, more Jews fought for Germany than fought for the Allies. And in the Holocaust, many Jews were brought out of their apartments in full dress uniform with all of their medals that they had earned fighting for the Germans in World War I. So it was not obvious to the Jews in Palestine that they should support the Allies. But to Jabotinsky, it became clear that the Ottoman Empire was not going to survive and that it was going to be the British that were going to have the future of Palestine in their hands. And so he lobbied with Joseph Trumpeldor in 1915 to create what was called the Zion Mule Corps, which consisted of several hundred Jewish men who had been exiled from Palestine to Egypt. And they actually fought in the Battle of Gallipoli and then were disbanded. Jabotinsky goes to London to petition to continue to create Jewish battalions. And eventually Britain allowed for the creation of 3 Jewish battalions. Jabotinsky fought in one in Palestine in 1918 toward the end of the war. He was among the group that was first to enter Transjordan. And in the midst of all of this, because of the Jewish support for Britain and the lobbying by the Zionist leadership toward the end of World War I, when it became clear the Ottoman Empire would fall and that they needed to curry favor with the British, that you have the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And so with the Balfour Declaration, there was a sense among most of the Zionist leadership that they should continue to play ball with the British, that it was British policy. Jabotinsky believed that that idea was naive. He believed instead that the British would curry favor with the Arabs instead of the Jews. And he believed that it was the responsibility of Jews to continue to fight and push for their own independence. This made him an outsider when it came to the Zionist leadership of the time. He continued to believe in the idea that there needed to be a Jewish armed fighting force. And so he created the Haganah. And this volunteer fighting force was actually used by the British in the outbreak of the Nebi Musa riots in Jerusalem in 1920. And it was during that time that Jabotinsky had a handgun. He was summoned by the British leader of Jerusalem and said, I need your help. And he said, I'm not going to help you with this. And he said, all right, then give me your gun. You are holding a gun illegally. And they arrested Jabotinsky. He eventually was thrown into prison and sentenced to 15 years. But there was such outrage because he was seen as such a hero among so many people, among the British for fighting with the British in World War I, by the Jews for creating this fighting force, that eventually he was released. He never got along well with that guy, Chaim Weizmann, who spurned him at that cafe in 1903. And then 20 years later, after another dispute and a sense of how to work with the British, he leaves the WZO and forms the Alliance of Revisionist Zionists, this idea that there needs to be a different way of practicing Zionism. And to help do this, he creates what's called Betar, which is the youth movement of his new organization. The youth movement, Betar, was named so for two reasons. One was he called it Brit Trumpeldor, the covenant of Trumpeldor, those who said that we need to fight and establish our own strength, right, which was his friend and his inspiration. And also Betar was the last Jewish fortress to fall in the Bar Kokhba revolt. And so Betar chapters form across Eastern Europe with thousands of adherents. And so it is when Begin, you wondered, I'm sure many of you were saying to yourselves, I thought we were teaching a class on Menachem Begin. You are teaching a class on Menachem Begin, but the Begin, when he's 13, is told to join by his father. They leave the regular Zionist clubs and he joins a Betar force. Betar becomes a youth group that almost has a paramilitary feel to it. They were given military-style uniforms. And in fact, in, I believe, 1926, they had a jamboree. And the jamboree was near Warsaw, and there were thousands, I think 3,000 young people participated, and they marched through the streets of Warsaw in these military-style uniforms and were greeted by the mayor of Warsaw, in addition to the leader of the Betar chapters. This is the world in which Begin is raised. With the limited time that we have left, I'm going to skip this passage from Jabotinsky to just take a look for a moment at the anthem of Betar. From the pit of decay and dust will arise to us a generation proud, generous, and fierce, fallen Betar, Yodfat, and Masada, risen again in strength and dignity. Dignity. A Jew, though in poverty, is of royal strain, slave or refuge, the son of a king. Crowned with the diadem of David in the open or in concealment, remember the crown, symbol of pride and fortitude. Hadar and Tagar, these two Hebrew terms, dignity and fortitude, become sort of the watchwords for Jabotinsky. Fortitude, Tagar, in the face of every obstacle, in times of ascent and of setbacks, a fire may still be lit with the flame of revolt, for silence is dirt. Sacrifice blood and spirit for the hidden glory. To die or to conquer the mountain, Yodfat, Masada, Betar. What are Yodfat and Masada? Those are two places where Jews, instead of surrendering, chose to commit mass suicide, and Betar was the last of the fortresses that fell during the Bar Kokhba revolt. So all of this background in which Begin is being raised is important for us to understand what will happen next in his life. That Begin is raised in a time and in a condition where the idea of Jewish self-defense, the idea of the cowering Jew who needs to hand over his fate to greater powers as opposed to grabbing those powers for himself, the image of that Jew from the city of slaughter, as Bialik describes, this is the image of the Jew that Begin is raised to reject. Eventually, as we'll learn next week, Begin becomes not only a leader in Betar and quite a good protege to Jabotinsky himself, but eventually becomes the successor to Jabotinsky and moves Jabotinsky's thought in a different direction, which we'll explore a little bit next week. I realize I'm a couple minutes over time, so grateful to have everybody here. I'm welcome to stay a few extra minutes if people want to ask some questions and continue the conversation for a few moments. For the rest of you, I will see you next Thursday at 10 a.m. or for services or lunch and learn or Torah study on Saturday or any of the wonderful things that Bethel is doing online. So thank you all very much. Lou, go ahead.
Yeah, my father, as a kid, as a young man in pre-war Poland, belonged to Beitar, and he used to tell me about seeing Jabotinsky in person, and described him as just a powerful orator, maybe third only to Hitler and Mussolini. Jabotinsky was buried in Long Island, and in 1979 or 80, and with instructions that he wasn't to be moved to be buried in Israel unless requested so by the government. And there had been liberal labor governments up until that time, and they never extended that invitation. So he was ultimately buried in Israel. And my father, who we owned a candy store then in the city, took the day off to see the cortege. It was like a funeral cortege from the cemetery to the airport.
Right, he died quite young, just shy of his 60th birthday. He was in the Catskills and died there. And
yeah, 1940.
Yeah. Interesting, good. Anybody else, thoughts, questions? So what's interesting is that the only person that they said was a better orator than Jabotinsky was Menachem Begin. And what's interesting is that when you look at pictures of these guys, they don't look like really imposing figures. You know, Begin looked old when he was young. And they, you know, the interesting thing is Begin's father was really more favoring his older brother Herzl than Menachem, but Menachem was the one who really embraced the Zionist ideology with greater fervor. And he started giving speeches when he was in his teens, and people were riveted by his oratory. I think those of us who only knew of Begin as Americans and never experienced the power of his oratory in Hebrew missed a major element. You know, most of us who even remember Begin, you know, remember his sort of halting English and that thick Israeli accent, you know, from say Camp David, from when he was older. Really the power of Begin throughout his life was his oratory. When Begin would speak in the Knesset, all the staff, including the custodians in the Knesset, they would say, Begin speaking, Begin speaking. And they would rush into the chamber and cram the visitors gallery of the chamber and line the walls just to hear him speak. Such was the power of his rhetoric and his oratory. And we'll see next week how he was able to parlay that into his leadership roles, first in Beitar, and then later into the other Zionist organizations and the creation of the Irgun and his leadership of the fighting forces, which would ultimately work to wrest Palestine and the independence of Israel from the British. So thank you all for joining. I hope you found this enjoyable and interesting. If not, send me an email and tell me what to fix. I'm open to your criticisms, but just wish everybody to stay healthy and safe and have a wonderful day.